is Ryan Regan from HKExcel. So if you're watching this video right now, you're probably a candidate for the IB who is going to graduate in November. Okay, so you're probably writing your TOK essay. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to give you something that you'll never find anywhere else on the internet. I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to do in order to get an A for your TOK essay. Okay, so for this year, we're going to give you the exact outline for one of the questions for the 2015 November TOK essay. We'll give you a detailed outline. We'll give you exactly the example. If you follow this video and you do your own research to back it up, you can at least get, I'm confident you'll get an A. Okay, but I want to tell you for this video, actually, myself, I don't normally teach TOK, but I have consulted with TOK experts at our company. Our company, HKExcel, teaches over 500 IB students every week from all around the world. And so those experts have consolidated their opinions and to create this video. Okay, so you really can't miss out on it. Okay, and after you watch this video, you can also download our sample TOK essay from the link below. Okay, we're going to look at part one. Okay, question one of the TOK essay. There are 5 questions you can choose from. I highly recommend you choose question 1. Okay. So this question is, there is no such neutral question. Evaluate the statement with at least 2 areas of knowledge. Okay, so let us talk about what you should put in your intro. Okay, so in your intro, in your introduction, you should definitely, okay, for a TOK essay, there are a few things you have to touch on 2 areas of knowledge, and not only that, you need to have 2 ways of knowing. You need to relate it to 2 ways of knowing for each areas of knowledge. So what are some ways of knowing? Ways of knowing are basically ways in which you learn something. For example, reasoning, logic, emotion, perception, language. Okay, so you need to touch on at least 2 ways of knowing for each area of knowledge. So in your first paragraph, what you should do is, of course, you always define key terms. So in here, you're going to define neutral. Okay, you probably want to have multiple definitions of neutral. Okay, so for example, one definition of neutral can be the lack of bias, right? The lack of prejudice, the lack of assumptions, okay? And the lack of decision making on the part of the knowledge creator. These can all be defined as neutral. But I recommend to look at the dictionary and sort of find sources to back that up. Okay, different definitions of neutral. Okay, and then you can explain the areas of knowledge you chose. So for example, you can say something like the areas of knowledge that will be considered are maths, which involves the ways of knowing language and reasoning, and religion, which requires the ways of knowing of emotion and language. Okay, something like that. Okay, so in here you just define neutral and state the related areas of knowledge and ways of knowing. Nothing much. Okay. Now let's talk about maths. Okay, so math is the first way of knowing I think you can choose. Okay, so for math, normally you have 2 paragraphs. Okay, so 1 area of knowledge, 2 paragraphs. 1 paragraph is arguing that math is neutral. Okay, the other paragraph is arguing that math is not neutral. Okay. So first, I'll explain to you how you can argue that math is neutral. Well, there are a few ways. First, you can argue that math is universally accepted. Okay, so you can give some examples of theories that are universally accepted. For example, with Pythagoras theorem. Okay, and you can say this all because this is based on logic and reasoning. Okay, math is based on logic and reasoning, and therefore, a lot of theories are universally accepted. Okay, and it's also widely applied in multiple fields. Okay, widely applied in multiple fields. You can give examples of theories that fulfill these 2 criteria. And you can also argue, okay, you can also bring up one term which is called the absolutist. Okay, so if you look at some math literature, you can look this up in Google. So there are 2 main philosophies in math. One is the absolutist, the other one is called fallibist. Okay, so absolutist, this is a math philosophy. It's a philosophy about maths. Okay, so some mathematicians have this philosophy, and basically it believes that math knowledge is certain. Okay, so it's right under all situations. Okay, so you can do some research about this absolutist perspective. Okay, and come up with examples of theories that are universally accepted, widely applied in multiple fields. So you can argue that if questions in math were not neutral, then the knowledge derived would not be neutral, and it cannot be applied in so many fields, and it would not be universally accepted, right? Now let's look at the counter-argument, which is more difficult. How can we argue that math is not neutral? Well, we can explain one thing, okay? So, we can talk about, language, okay, used in math, okay, can affect one's perception of math. Okay, so actually language is a way of knowing used in math, and because language, the choice of language, okay, you can explain how the choice of language used in math can be biased. Okay, so for example, why would one mathematician choose to explain a theory a certain way? Okay, this can be, so the choice of word that they use may be biased. Okay, and one more thing you can talk about is basically, so to give you one example, okay, you can talk about how zero was invented in India a long time ago. The number 0 was invented in India. Okay, so the derivation of this kind of knowledge is biased. If zero were not invented, maths would be very different. Okay, but so this suggests how maths is based on some assumptions. Okay. Furthermore, using 0 as an example, 0 is a language, right? So why do the mathematicians use this symbol to represent 0? So there's an inherent bias to use this type of symbol to represent what 0 is, right? So this is one way you can argue how it is biased. Language used in math is a biased process. Okay. And one more thing you can talk about is like the real world application of math. Okay. So when mathematicians decide to apply certain theories in the real world, you can argue that it is a biased process. Because so why do they choose to apply such a theory into such a situation? This is inherently a biased process. So it's based on the interest of the mathematician himself. So this questioning process is biased. Okay. Let's focus on natural sciences. Okay. So for natural sciences, again, claim and counterclaim. You always want to look at both sides. Okay, so how can we argue that natural science is neutral, it's not biased? Okay, well, we can talk about how experimental procedures are standardized. Okay, so there are universal standards to carrying out an experiment. For example, there needs to be a control variable. There needs to be a dependent variable and independent variable, right? So this way of experiment is standardized. Therefore, one can argue that when one carries out an experiment, it is neutral. Okay, and you can also link it to like logic and reasoning are used. Okay, when designing experiments. Okay, and because there's a universal standard, it is neutral. Okay, there's no personal judgment involved. Okay, and to give some example, you can also talk about like for example, in microbiology, this narrow field, so in order for an experiment to be universally recognized, it needs to fulfill certain criteria. For example, the bacteria must be isolated. Okay, there has to be some basic testing about the bacteria before one can use a kind of bacteria for experimentation. So these kind of standardization across the industry, across the academia, can suggest that it is neutral. Okay. But however, how can we argue that natural science is not neutral? Well, our experiences are based on prior knowledge, right? So different people have different prior knowledge. Therefore, the way that experiments can be derived can be different. So they're based on different assumptions. Different experience may be based on different assumptions. Okay. So you can explain how, and even perception, right? You can argue perception. So during an experiment, scientist uses perception to make observations, right? So, and when perception is used, there's always selective observation. So this is biased in and of itself, right? So you can say, because perception is used, so scientists can choose to perceive certain information but ignore certain information. This is an inherent bias. Personal judgment is involved. Okay, and to give an example, you can use Craig Venter. Okay, Craig Venter. So I'll this to give you a bit of background information. This guy is a scientist who basically modeled an ecosystem when the Earth just started to come together. Okay, so Craig Venter wanted to investigate how living organisms came to being in the world and on Earth. Okay, and he simulated an ecosystem for the beginning of time. Okay, but you can argue that this experiment is biased because it's based on his assumptions. He assumed that the beginning of time was a certain way. Okay, so because of those assumptions, the question he asked, okay, was biased because it's based on his assumptions. Okay, so you can research more on this scientist. Okay, give you just one more area of knowledge, just in case you want more. Okay, and if the last two didn't make sense to you, maybe you like to use this one. Okay, so let's first argue, why is religion neutral? Well, for religion, you can talk about emotion and perception. Okay, so you can talk about Hinduism. Okay, Hinduism is a very good example to argue why religion is neutral. Why? Because many books believe that is the first religion ever. Okay, Hinduism is the first religion ever, and Hinduism knowledge basically were based on people's perception, right, and emotion, probably, right? So Hinduism beliefs were developed based on perception and emotion. Okay, so we can argue that there's no bias because it is the first religion. Okay, okay, so it was not affected by any kind of dogma. Okay, you can do more research in Hinduism, but this is the big idea. Okay, you can also use another example, which is atheism. Okay, you can argue that atheism is a neutral kind of belief because it is it's not crowded by dogma, okay, or a religious doctrine. Okay, and then for the counter argument, okay, religion is not neutral. Well, you can talk about how religions are all mostly developed by certain founders. Okay, it's based on the founders' beliefs, right? So it is based on his personal judgment. That's why we can argue it is biased. Okay, you can also argue that faith. So religion is based on the emotion of faith, right? Faith is biased in and of itself because faith is selective believing, right? So it's faith can blind a person's perception, logic, etc., right? Okay, it can cause somebody to ignore logic. So faith in and of itself is a biased thing. Therefore, you can argue religion is based on faith. So religious questioning, religious knowledge must be biased. Okay, and you can give Buddhism as an example. So Buddhism is a good example that religion is biased because Buddhism is actually based on Hinduism. If you do some research about how Buddhism came about, you will find that Buddhism is actually a kind of knowledge that is based on Hinduism. Okay, but the founders of Buddhism disagreed with Hinduism, with many things in Hinduism. Therefore, he developed a new religion that is quite different from Hinduism. Okay, so the coming about of Buddhism was based on a disagreement with Hinduism. Okay. Okay, so for your conclusion, basically you want to explain that. So for TOK essay, there's always two sides. So you can say something like, so to a certain extent, some knowledge is biased. Well, to a certain extent, some forms of questioning are neutral. Okay, So you can say in some knowledge there's inherent bias. You can summarize all the arguments you made about why knowledge is biased. And then you can say, but in other circumstances, the not questioning is neutral. Okay, then you can give examples of the points you made. So basically in the end you said, to a certain extent I agree that there's inherent bias in any form of questioning. Something like that. Okay. So I hope this video helps. As I said just now, you can download our sample essay, okay, written by our TOK expert. You can use that as a, of course we don't encourage plagiarism here, but I hope this video gives you a very clear map on how to tackle the TOK essay, especially the 2015.